Sigmund Freud was not a passive observer of reality. He was, in his own words, a conqueror. To grasp the scale of his ambition, we must place ourselves in the small town of Freiburg in what is now the Czech Republic, where in 1856 a child was born wrapped in an amniotic membrane, an omen, according to local superstition, of a destiny marked by greatness. His mother, Amalia Nathanson, a woman of strong character and overflowing vitality, cast upon her firstborn an almost religious devotion. He was her golden Siggy. This belief that he was the chosen one, a child meant for something extraordinary, instilled in Freud an unshakable self-confidence, but it also planted the seed of a relentless inner demand that would follow him to the grave. The family's move to Vienna marked the beginning of his true formation. By the late 19th century, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a city of contradictions. On one side, suffocating social etiquette and an omnipresent Catholic Puritanism. On the other, an intellectual and artistic ferment beginning to challenge the very foundations of modernity. Young Freud, brilliant and fluent in several languages, immersed himself in medical studies. Yet his interest did not lie in conventional clinical practice. What captivated him was the mystery of life in its most elemental form. During his years in the laboratory of the physiologist Ernst Brücke, Freud spent months dissecting hundreds of male eels in an attempt to locate their testicles, an organ that at the time had eluded scientific discovery. This anecdote, often told with a touch of humor, is in fact a key to his later thinking, the tireless search for what is hidden, for what is there yet refuses to reveal itself at first glance. Freud wanted to find the physical seat of desire, the biological root of reproduction, but he would soon realize that the scalpel was too blunt an instrument for the secrets he hoped to uncover.
During this period, Freud also felt the strain of being a Jew in a society that, while allowing his intellectual rise, never stopped reminding him that he was, in some sense, an outsider. That sense of marginality proved decisive. It gave him the freedom to become an iconoclast, to challenge the dogmas of Viennese medicine with the intensity of someone who feels he has little to lose. By the time he completed his studies, the conqueror was ready for his first great battle, though it would arrive in the unexpected form of a white crystalline substance that seemed to promise a transformation of the world. After returning from Paris, Freud found himself increasingly alone. His former mentor, Joseph Breuer, had introduced him to the case of Anna O., a young woman suffering from hallucinations and paralysis. It was she who gave a name to the process, the talking cure. Yet Freud went further than Breuer. Where Breuer recoiled from the emotional intensity of his patients, Freud felt drawn to it, almost like a detective standing before a crime scene, compelled to look closer. Still, the true turning point came in 1896 with the death of his own father, Jacob Freud. That loss plunged him into a period of anxiety and profound inner questioning. Why would a man of science experience such an unsettling fear of death after the passing of an elderly father? The answer was not to be found in textbooks, but in his own memories. Freud began his self-analysis, a descent into the depths of his childhood. Alone in his study, examining his own dreams, he uncovered forbidden desire, rivalry, and guilt. It was in this time of almost complete isolation that he wrote The Interpretation of Dreams, published symbolically in 1900, as if to mark the threshold of a new century.
It was here that he introduced the idea of latent content, the notion that your dreams are not what they seem, but rather coded messages, hieroglyphs shaped by repressed desires. Yet what truly made Vienna tremble was his claim that these desires had a sexual root reaching all the way back to the cradle. Freud had, in effect, declared war on the idea of childhood innocence, suggesting that from the very first breath, the human being is a bundle of drives. And how was a Victorian society meant to react to the suggestion that a child's love for his mother concealed, deep down, a wish to possess her and to displace the father? The conqueror was on the verge of becoming the most reviled man in Europe. If you could open your mind the way one opens an engine, what parts would you find inside? Freud was not satisfied with describing symptoms. He set out to draw a topographical map of the soul. It was during the first decade of the 20th century that he consolidated his theory of the id, the ego, and the superego. For Freud, mental health is not the absence of conflict, but a fragile balance within an ongoing civil war taking place inside your own mind. The id is the cauldron of instinctual drives. It is an eternal newborn, guided solely by the pleasure principle. It knows nothing of morality, time, or logic. It is the force that pushes you to eat, to desire, and at times to destroy.
The superego is the inner policeman. It is built from the prohibitions of parents and society. It is pure guilt, the demand for perfection that punishes us whenever the id tries to get its way. The ego is the exhausted mediator. It is the part of you trying to keep your job, pay the bills, and behave like a decent citizen, while the id is urging you to take what you want, and the superego is whispering that you are not good enough. Freud came to see that when the anxiety created by this inner conflict becomes unbearable, the ego begins to lie in order to survive. We invent explanations for our failures, rationalization, or we project our own hostility onto others. According to Freud, you are not quite who you believe yourself to be. You are, in many ways, a defensive construction shaped to shield you from your own darker desires. This was perhaps the final blow to human narcissism. Not only were we no longer the center of the universe, thanks to Copernicus, nor the crown of creation, thanks to Darwin. Now we were told that we were not even masters of our own minds.
Freud did not only write theory, he wrote clinical novels. His case studies read like files in which trauma disguises itself as metaphor. To grasp the depth of his method, we need to look at 3 of his most emblematic cases. 1. The Rat Man, Ernst Lonser. A young officer came to Freud tormented by an obsession that made ordinary life impossible. The fear that his father and the woman he loved would be subjected to a brutal torture involving starving rats. Over years of analysis, Freud unraveled the symbolic threads of this fear. The rats, he argued, were tied not only to cruelty, but also to money. Raten in German means installments, and to a deep, repressed anger towards his deceased father. From this case emerged one of the foundational explorations of obsessive neurosis. It leaves us with an unsettling question. What if your most irrational fear were in truth a desire for revenge you cannot bear to acknowledge? 2. The Wolfman, Sergei Pankajev. Sergei repeatedly dreamed of white wolves sitting in a tree staring at him. For Freud, this was no ordinary dream. It was, he believed, a kind of psychic photograph, a trace of what he called the primal scene. He theorized that as an infant, Sergei had witnessed a sexual encounter between his parents and that his mind had frozen that experience, only to process it years later through the language of phobia. Although Sergei himself never felt fully cured, the case cemented a radical idea that the earliest years of life shape the very architecture of the adult mind.
3. The case of Dora, or Ida Bauer. Dora became the great failure that taught Freud more than any apparent success. She was a young woman effectively handed over by her father to a family friend as an object of seduction in exchange for that man turning a blind eye to the father's own affair. Freud focused intensely on the sexual symbolism within Dora's dreams, overlooking the simpler truth that she was being manipulated by the men around her. Dora eventually ended the treatment, yet she left Freud with something invaluable, the concept of transference. He realized that a patient does not see the analyst as he truly is, but projects onto him the figures of the past. If you find yourself hating your therapist, you may well be directing at him the anger you once felt towards your father. Freud did not want followers, he wanted loyal defenders of his vision. In Berggasse 19, he founded the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, a group of men who met on Wednesday evenings and even wore identical rings engraved with ancient gods. It was within this circle that his relationship with his spiritual son, Carl Gustav Jung, would unfold. Jung seemed the ideal heir, young, brilliant, and crucially not Jewish, something Freud believed might help psychoanalysis gain broader acceptance within the scientific establishment. But Jung began to challenge Freud's emphasis on sexuality, proposing instead the existence of a more mystical, collective unconscious. The break between them was fierce. Freud, unable to tolerate what he saw as dissent, pushed Jung out of his inner circle. The tension ran so deep that Freud reportedly suffered several physical fainting spells during their confrontations. For him, any departure from his theory felt like a personal betrayal.
The conqueror was slowly turning into an intellectual tyrant, withdrawing into his study, surrounded by figurines of ancient, silent gods, while the world outside edged towards the slaughter of the First World War. As Freud's name echoed through the salons of Europe, behind the doors of his home at Berggasse 19, a far more intimate drama was unfolding, one that today would challenge any modern code of ethics. Sigmund was not only a theorist of the soul, he was also a father who chose to turn his own family into a living laboratory. His youngest daughter, Anna, was not merely his intellectual heir, she became his most devoted patient, and, in the eyes of some, his most tragic one. For years, in a situation that would unsettle any contemporary therapist, Freud personally analyzed Anna. Night after night, she lay on the couch and revealed to her own father her most private fantasies, her fears, her inner conflicts. This radical transparency forged a bond of fierce loyalty, one that seemed to bind her entirely to him. Anna never married, never built a life beyond the shadow of Sigmund. She became the Antigone of psychoanalysis, dedicating herself completely to safeguarding her father's ideas. In that smoke-filled study, the line between filial love and clinical experiment blurred in a way that would never quite be undone.
But Anna was not the only constant presence in those sessions. At the foot of the couch, a silent observer seemed to pass judgment on the truthfulness of each patient. Joffy, Freud's Chow Chow. The father of modern psychology, so distrustful of human consciousness, placed an almost unquestioning faith in animal instinct. If Joffy moved away from a patient, Freud would take it as a sign that something was being concealed, that a deeper resistance was at work. There is something deeply ironic in the image of the man who sought to map the human mind, relying on a dog's instinct to confirm his insights. If you had walked through the streets of Vienna in 1915 and climbed to the first floor of 19 Berggasse, you would not have entered a medical office, but something closer to an archaeological sanctuary. Freud had no taste for the cold sterility of hospitals. His study was layered with Persian rugs, heavy drapes, and more than 2,000 ancient figurines, Egyptian deities, Greek busts, Chinese statues, all watching silently from their shelves. For him, the psychoanalyst was not a doctor in the traditional sense, but an archaeologist, patiently brushing away the sediment of memory to uncover the buried city of childhood trauma. The ritual rarely changed. The patient lay on the now famous couch, facing away from Freud. This arrangement, today an icon of psychology, grew out of a very human admission. Freud confessed that he could not endure being stared at for hours on end. Seated behind the patient, out of sight, he listened to what he called free association. He asked them to speak without censorship, without forcing coherence, allowing words to flow as they came. It was here that he came to believe something unsettling. Language betrays us. When a patient misspoke, what we now call a Freudian slip, he did not see it as a simple stumble of the tongue, but as a disclosure from the unconscious. If you called your wife by your mother's name, it was not mere distraction, it was the id breaking through the restraints of the superego, if only for a fleeting second.
That space was also the stage for his most rigid habits. Freud was a man bound to routine. He rose at 7, saw patients until 1, lunched with his family in near silence, walked briskly around Vienna's Ringstrasse, and devoted his evenings to letters and essays until well past midnight. This almost military discipline was his armor against his own neuroses. He suffered from a specific fear of the number 62. He was convinced he would die at that age and avoided any hotel or room bearing the number. The man who dissected the fears of others lived himself under the weight of superstitions he could not quite master. How did a theory born in a modest Viennese study come to shape the way the modern world understands itself? The answer lies in the expansion of psychoanalysis beyond the individual and into society and culture. Freud came to believe that his discoveries illuminated not only personal conflict, but also the behavior of crowds. In Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, he described with unsettling clarity how charismatic leaders step into the place of the ideal father within the superego of citizens, giving them permission to commit acts of violence they might never carry out alone. Yet perhaps his most concrete and least acknowledged legacy emerged through his nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays took his uncle's insights into unconscious desire and applied them to something that would reshape the modern world: public relations and advertising. If today you buy a sports car because it makes you feel powerful, or a fragrance because it promises to make you irresistible, you are responding to a strategy rooted in Freudian thinking. Bernays understood that to sell a product, one must not appeal to reason, but to the hidden impulses of the id. In this way, Freud became, almost inadvertently, one of the architects of the consumer culture that now defines us. In the creative realm, psychoanalysis became the spark for an unprecedented explosion. The Surrealist movement would scarcely have existed without Freud. When Salvador Dalí painted melting clocks or dreamlike landscapes, he was trying to give form to what Freud had described in the interpretation of dreams. Dalí even traveled to London to meet the man he admired so deeply, sketching his portrait with a skull shaped like a snail. Freud, though often skeptical of modern art, admitted that the Surrealists were among the few who truly grasped his insight, that what we call reality is only a surface, a mask covering a far more unsettling world that unfolds while we sleep. Today, even if many of his biological theories have been revised or surpassed, Freud's language has become the language of the 21st century. Words like trauma, repression, ego, and denial have slipped into everyday speech. He stripped away the comfort of innocence and in its place handed us something far more demanding: the responsibility to confront our own shadows.
And yet, for all his determination to chart every corner of the unconscious, there remained one territory he admitted, almost at the end of his life, still felt like unknown land: the female psyche. In his study, surrounded by statues of ancient goddesses, the conqueror of the mind often felt adrift. His famous question, written with a blend of frustration and scientific curiosity, still echoes through the history of psychology. Was will das Weib? What does a woman want?
For Freud, femininity was not a simple natural state, but a complex and often traumatic construction. His theory, inevitably shaped by the patriarchal atmosphere of fin de siècle Vienna, proposed that a woman's development revolved around a sense of lack. It was here that he introduced the controversial idea of penis envy, a concept that would later provoke strong criticism from early feminist thinkers and even from some of his own colleagues. According to Freud, when a young girl became aware of anatomical difference, she experienced it as a kind of loss, a symbolic castration, leading to feelings of inferiority that, in his view, were resolved through motherhood. And yet, beneath what today feels like a reductive framework, there was also an undeniable urgency, a man trying to grasp a force he sensed slipping beyond his reach. While formulating these provocative ideas, Freud was in fact surrounded by women of formidable intellect, women who did not neatly fit into his theories. The most compelling of them was Lou Andreas Salome. She was no compliant patient. She was a philosopher who had already captivated Nietzsche and Rilke before ever engaging with Freud's circle. Lou was one of the rare figures who dared to challenge him directly, suggesting that femininity was not defined by lack, but could instead embody a form of creative and affirmative narcissism. Freud, who struggled to tolerate dissent from male disciples like Jung or Adler, felt for Lou something closer to reverence. She embodied what he could not easily codify, a mind that did not seek permission to exist. This tension was also visible in his relationship with the so-called hysterics of the Salpêtrière and of Vienna. Today we may question many of his conclusions, yet it is worth remembering that Freud was among the first to take women's accounts seriously at a time when medicine dismissed them as malingerers or reduced their suffering to disorders of the womb. By listening to them, by offering them a space that felt almost sacred on his couch, he returned to them a voice, even if he later filtered that voice through his own Victorian assumptions. The paradox is striking. While attempting to define woman as somehow incomplete, Freud was simultaneously creating the very method that would allow women of the 20th century to loosen the mental chains imposed upon them. He became a liberator without fully grasping the nature of the freedom he was helping to unleash. Even within his own household, this tension never quite disappeared. His wife, Martha, embodied domestic order and the shelter of tradition, while his sister-in-law, Minna Bernays, shared with him a deep intellectual affinity and, according to some biographers, perhaps even a discreet romance that lingered in the shadows of Berggasse. Between the mother, the devoted wife, the daughter patient, and the brilliant colleague, Freud lived surrounded by a feminine presence that quietly unsettled his desire for structure and mastery. In the end, the man who believed he had stripped bare the human soul had to concede that female desire remained a hieroglyph, one whose key he would carry with him to the grave. The Great War altered Freud profoundly. Watching a supposedly civilized Europe tear itself apart in the trenches led him to a stark conclusion, which he expressed in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Until then, he had believed that human beings were fundamentally driven by the pursuit of pleasure. Now he came to recognize something darker within us, a death drive, what he called thanatos. It is that shadowed impulse that pushes us to repeat our mistakes, to sabotage what we cherish, and perhaps, at the deepest level, to long for a return to the stillness of inanimate dust. This pessimism was not merely philosophical, it became painfully physical. Freud paid the price for what he himself might have called an unresolved oral phase, an unrelenting addiction to cigars. He smoked around 20 a day, even when a persistent pain in his palate began to trouble him. The diagnosis was devastating: cancer of the jaw. From 1923 onwards, his life turned into an ordeal marked by 33 operations. Doctors fitted him with a large metal and rubber prosthesis to separate his mouth from his nasal cavity, a device he grimly referred to as the monster. Eating became an ordeal. Speaking was agony. The apparatus caused wounds that never fully healed. And yet he refused strong medication that might cloud his thinking. "I would rather suffer and think clearly than drift safely in a haze," he insisted. In the grip of chronic pain, he wrote Civilization and Its Discontents, his darkest work, where he concluded that civilization itself is a necessary prison. In order to live together, we must repress our instincts, and that repression condemns us to a lasting unease. Freud was no longer analyzing individuals, he was performing, in a sense, an autopsy on humanity itself. Soon the world beyond his study grew as menacing as the illness consuming his face. In 1933, in Berlin's public squares, the Nazis threw Freud's books into the flames. The elderly professor responded with a flash of his old irony. "What progress we are making! In the Middle Ages they would have burned me. Nowadays they are content with burning my books." But irony gave way to fear in 1938, when Hitler annexed Austria. The Gestapo entered his home. They arrested Anna, and for an entire day Freud paced his study like a caged lion, fearing that his daughter might be tortured. Owing to the international influence of Princess Marie Bonaparte and several American diplomats, he was eventually granted permission to leave for exile in London. But the price was bitter. He was required to sign an official statement declaring that the Nazis had treated him with respect. With one final gesture of intellectual defiance, he added a line beneath his signature: "I can warmly recommend the Gestapo to anyone." Freud arrived in London like a dying prophet. His 4 elderly sisters, who remained in Vienna, would later perish in the gas chambers, a horror he was spared from witnessing. In September 1939, barely 3 weeks after the outbreak of the Second World War, the smell of necrosis from his jaw had become so overwhelming that even his dog, Jofi, withdrew to the farthest corner of the room. Freud called his doctor, Max Schur, and reminded him of their pact. "You promised you would not let me suffer when the time came." With Anna's consent, Schur administered 3 heavy doses of morphine. The man who had spent his life awakening humanity from its illusions drifted into a final sleep from which he would not return. This journey through the depths of the unconscious leaves us facing a man who, with all his brilliance and all his contradictions, altered forever the way we look at ourselves. Sigmund Freud opened the door, but he was not the only one to step through and explore what lay beyond. If you want to discover the other side of this story, the disciple who became a rival, who chose to explore not only trauma, but also spirituality and the realm of collective myth, you won't want to miss our analysis of Carl Jung, where we delve into the great rupture that split the map of the human soul in 2.